Hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you back to my channel. I grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia, without any greenhouses or grow lights or humidifiers, just me growing these indoors or outdoors or not at all. So if that sounds of any interest to you, do hit subscribe. I post every Friday chronicling my continuing very amateurish adventures. If you're in a similar climate to mine, might be of some use. Let's quickly talk about climate. I'm in Melbourne, southeast Australia, which is described as either a wet Mediterranean or a warm temperate climate. We don't have the same zonal systems as you do in the USA. You could, in a long bow, say we are similar to a zone 9, asterisk subject to variation, because zone 9 also applies to Southern Ireland. So there you go. We don't have the same system. In a nutshell, we have cold, wet winters that don't freeze, and we can have hot, dry summers that can also rain. So that sounds like you. This might be of some use. And today, plant lovers, oh my goodness, just look at this. And I'll do a long shot to show you. This plant is dripping, is the word that springs to mind. Dripping in blooms. And it is, and I don't have the label because it's disappeared, but it is a species Cymbidium, and it's called Cymbidium wenchanense. Now, Cymbidiums, we know, the wenchanense refers to a city, or perhaps a town in southern China called Wenshan, which is apparently a bit of a hotspot for the selling and trading of native orchids, which perhaps have been collected in the wild, obviously. And this orchid was described in 1990 by a Chinese botanist, and when he went back to find it in 2014 in Wenshan near the area, gone. So plant lovers, a very sad thing, but it's very easy to grow from seed, and I think all of the plants, well, particularly in Australia, it would be from imported seed. So if you're lucky enough to be able to get your hands on it, there are plants available which I think have all been grown from seed, because we do not endorse the wild collecting of orchids unless it's by, you know, a registered botanic garden who's doing it to save the orchid. But isn't that a sad story? Just hoping that perhaps somewhere else in that region this orchid is still enjoying its wildlife somewhere. Let's not start with the negatives. Let's start with the positives. This is the most glorious Cymbidium, really, I think I've had to flower. Now, there are Cymbidiums and there are Cymbidiums. Now, I really like species Cymbidiums because the flowers are simpler, often just a lot more elegant, I find. I do have hybrid Cymbidiums, but the species ones I just think are really beautiful and make an interesting contrast to those very sort of decorative and overblown hybrids that you can get. And this one, I'm not sure if this has been used in any crosses yet because it's still relatively new in the Cymbidium world, but what a beautiful orchid. Anyway, we should start at the very beginning and go through all of its care needs so that you will know exactly how to grow this beautiful species Cymbidium. So firstly, of course, the name, Wenchanense, it is named after the town which it was found nearby. So that's nice and logical. We do like that. And I'll show you on the map. And it comes from that area, that magic botanical hotspot of sort of southern China and then northern Vietnam, Laos, that mountainous area where all manner of amazing plants, not just orchids, have evolved over time. Quite amazing, one of those hotspots. So it comes from there, high altitude, and it's an epiphyte, as most, I think, fair to say, species Cymbidiums are. But, you know, there are epiphytes and epiphytes. There are epiphytes that literally just cling to the side of a tree with aerial roots, like Phalaenopsis, for example. And then there are epiphytes that sort of live in the nooks of trees where detritus has gathered a bit of leaf litter and, you know, stuff. So it's like in a little bowl, little cavity. So hence, they're often liking to be tightly potted or pot bound because they're in quite constricted physical spaces. So kind of epiphytes and epiphytes. This one is one of those that will grow in a fork and a nook of a tree. And it is quite a misty, humid environment, so that is also important to remember. But what is most interesting, or perhaps important, is that it is cool in winter / cold. So not perhaps freezing, but certainly close. And Melbourne is the perfect environment for Cymbidiums because we have cold, wet winters that don't freeze. We get very rarely in Melbourne City do we get to 0 degrees Celsius, which is 32 degrees Fahrenheit, rarely. And we rarely get frosts in the city. So quite safe in terms of that aspect of orchid growing. And our summers can be hot and dry, but the average humidity throughout the year is never too low. So we're not particularly a dry city, whereas certain other places in Australia certainly are. Their airborne humidity is much lower on average. So quite a good natural environment really that suits Cymbidiums. Now, I made a care video, and in fact, also in my What Do You Do in Spring video, I showed you where I grow my Cymbidiums. They're basically outdoors, undercover, so they get protection from rain, but they get plenty of dappled light, and they're actually sitting underneath a row of silver birch trees, which obviously are deciduous. So more light in winter, less light in summer, which is not a bad thing because harsh, really strong direct light can burn the leaves. But most Cymbidiums will benefit from slightly stronger light in winter because it just stimulates the flowers. Not all of them come from deciduous forests though in their native environments, but it's a good kind of rule of thumb, I think, to give them a little bit more light in winter if you can. Still diffused and dappled, not super direct. So that's light. Temperature we've covered. They can go quite low and they can go quite high. The thing is always the moisture in the air if you've got high temperatures. Which brings us naturally, neatly segueing to watering. Cymbidiums, it's an epiphyte. So if you imagine you're living in the fork of a tree in quite a humid atmosphere though, so lots of airborne moisture that your roots and leaves can drink in. When it rains, that water is going to collect and then it's going to evaporate and drain away. So dry, wet, dry, wet, dry, wet. And lots of epiphytes do like to dry out reasonably between rain because it doesn't rain every day, except perhaps in monsoon seasons. But a lot of orchids do like to dry out-ish. Obviously, it depends where they're from. And I find Cymbidiums do like to dry out reasonably well before each watering. And I treat mine a bit mean, I have to say. If I go on holiday, for example, I give them a huge soaking beforehand, assuming it's in summer, and then just leave them. And they just have to fend for themselves. And they are as tough as nuts generally. Most of those hybrids have huge pseudobulbs, which store enormous amounts of water and energy. So if you're going on holiday, I don't think you have to worry about Cymbidiums. This one, though, has a slightly different growth form, and I'll show you the pseudobulb. So they're just a bit smaller and the leaves are sort of fanning out, so not quite the same structure. Nonetheless, I'm still just going to abandon this whenever I go on holiday. But watering in winter is something that you still should do, so they do like to dry out between waterings-ish, but I still water them in winter, all of them. Whether they're species Cymbidium or whether they are hybrid Cymbidiums, I water all of them at the same time, in the same frequency, so they either get it or they don't. There's no special treatment for any of them. Now, I made a video a while back about a species Cymbidium called Erythrostilum, which is a beautiful plant, but much smaller in its habit, but the flowers aren't dissimilar. And although this is quite a new discovery in 1990, it is thought to be quite closely related to Erythrostilum. I'll link that video below. You can actually see the flowers are not dissimilar. Different sort of form of plant. So let's look at the plant. Very grassy, strappy leaves. So as you can see, they're much narrower than your sort of average hybrid Cymbidium, but quite a large arcing plant. And I will come in and show you that the growth of it is actually the growth is slightly different, as you can see. So we can see here, perhaps spinning this around, right round, baby, right round. So there you go, there's your pseudobulb. So it is sort of pseudo-bulby, but it certainly doesn't look quite the same as your hybrid Cymbidium pseudobulb. And then the leaves arc out of here. And then as you can see, this is the flower spike, and the flower spike emerges from the base of the pseudobulb, much like a hybrid Cymbidium would. As you can see, still in its plastic pot, plant lovers, because I bought this 6 months ago, I suppose, from a specialist rare plant sale. Oh my goodness, plant lovers, join orchid clubs. That's what I'm saying. Find an orchid club that's near you if you're lucky enough to have one. And one of the benefits of those is that they tend to have private sales for members. And this is where I got this from. I've never seen it for sale anywhere. Look at the size of that specimen. It's amazing. Like many Cymbidiums, it really likes to be pot bound. As you can see, this is bursting out. And I think actually what I will do as the season progresses and these flower spikes die off, so late spring, perhaps early summer, I will repot this. A shallow pot, but a bit wider, but not a huge size bigger, because you don't want to over pot them. They do like to be tight. Imagine they're nestling in that crook of a tree. that tree nook is not going to get any bigger. The plant is just going to sort of spill out and sow its seeds and spread that way. So I've had this plant for about 6 months, so it's been through winter and now it is spring and it's coming into bloom. It's kind of lovely having this canopy of Cymbidium grassy leaves. So it is a spring bloomer, as we can see, and the flower spikes took, like most Cymbidiums, quite a while to sort of mature, and then the actual blooms did take quite a while to ping open. We've just had a string of sort of slightly warmer days and all of the flowers have opened, which is really, really beautiful. This though, apparently, and I don't know yet because I haven't been through summer, is a little bit susceptible to the heat if it's in bloom. Obviously, it doesn't bloom in summer. So should you have exceptionally hot weather in spring, it might suffer a little bit, but mine is loving it. It's 20 degrees Celsius today, which is about 68 degrees Fahrenheit. So beautiful, not super hot. Look, fine, and it's just made all of the blooms ping open. Now, says everywhere, whenever I've read it, quote unquote, very fragrant. Just saying, plant lovers, I wouldn't say it's very fragrant. I would say there's an odor. Not particularly attractive. It's not awful. It's not like a sort of an arum rotting flesh smell. Yeah, it's just sort of a slightly musky flower smell. Certainly not something that you notice you've got to get your nose in. So not one of those kind of sweet, beautiful orchid fragrances. But aren't the flowers beautiful? So they've sort of got this beautiful, slightly pink flush to the sepals and the petals, and the lip has got slightly stronger, I would say, burgundy stripes on a sort of a very faint yellow background. And they're sort of slightly hooded and they sort of look a bit tired. I don't know, but they've got a very lovely habit, quite droopy. Thus, it is actually, I think, quite a good idea to elevate the plant so you're looking up at the blooms. So this is probably a plant that would do very well in hanging baskets. And because it's fairly tough and it can stay outside all year, in our new house, I might be able to do that. Not such a problem if it does get rained on, as long as it's free draining medium that it's potted in. So I think Cymbidiums generally can get rained on if your climate can take it. Just ensure that the medium is free draining and that the pot's slightly elevated, because most of them do like to just be off the ground. So the Chinese grow them by tipping up terracotta pots and putting the pot on top. So you've kind of got a bit of distance from the ground. And in that way, even if it gets rained on, it's going to drain very quickly. Which, nice segue to potting. I haven't repotted mine, plant lovers, and I can't tell you what is going on, but you know what? That is just a tangled pot of roots. I can't see the medium, but it's an epiphyte. So when I do come to repot it, I'm actually going to use out of the bag potting mix, because that's what I do with Cymbidiums. They just seem to like it. And again, if you imagine where it's living in the forks of trees. All manner of sort of debris is going to collect in there. There will be the sort of gritty, grainy soil elements. There will be leaf mulch. There will be bits of wood. I mean, who knows what's going to be? Bits of bark, dead animal. I mean, anyway. So I think we can just sort of relax a little bit about what must I pot my Cymbidiums in. As long as it's free draining and not too compacted, I think you're going to be fine. So you could use your own mix of medium-sized bark with sphagnum moss, for example. Or, like me, I'm going to use an out-of-the-bag orchid mix, which is sort of medium bark and cocoa husk with just a little bit more of a gritty, soily element to it. And I use that for a lot of aroids because it's very free-draining, but just got a little bit more substance. Fertilizer-wise, exactly the same as any other Cymbidium. So I made a what do I do in spring video, and in spring I give a topical application of a slow-release fertilizer pellets to all of my orchids, asterisks, except the ones I don't, which are the ones that are still dormant. Watch that video if you want to know what they are. Slow release fertilizer is heat activated, and so it will release over usually 6 months, but it will tell you on the packet you might get a 12-month one. It depends. Heat activated though, so obviously they start their release in spring, sort of through summer, and then fade off in autumn as the pellet is used up and spent, which is kind of good timing because you don't really want to be fertilizing many orchids in winter. And then I do a topical application of a liquid fertilizer or tonic, maybe every 3 or 4 waterings. The Cymbidiums, I have to say, because they're out the front, I do get a bit slack and often forget, but I do try and do it at least every 3 or 4 waterings. So that can either be a liquid fertilizer, plant fertilizer, which could be orchid specific, dial it down to sort of 1/6, 1/8 of the recommended dose, I always do, or a tonic, which could be diluted worm juice from a worm farm or diluted seaweed-based solution, which is what I use. It's an Australian brand called Sea Sol. And again, I dilute that to 1/8, 1/10 of what's recommended on the bottle. Other than that, when I water my Cymbidiums, I hose them with a hose pipe, so they get really, really drenched. I've never had any issue with moisture in the leaf joints of Cymbidiums. Depends where you are though. It might sort of promote all manner of unpleasant growth, but not for me. And in that way, you're creating ambient humidity as well. So all the area around gets wet, so that is then going to evaporate and create a little sort of humidity crib around the orchid. So in summer, that's a great idea. Hose it all down. It's nice and humid. And in winter, our ambient humidity is quite high anyway. And there's often sort of misty rain, which will blow over them. So in winter, I don't worry that much. So there we are. Cymbidium wenchanense, a beautiful, beautiful orchid. And mine has got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spikes dripping in blooms. And I will say the only issue is something which happens to a lot of my orchids outdoors. I made a video about Sologene cristata and the same thing happened, is that something just likes having a nibble on those buds before they open, most likely slugs and snails. I use an organic snail pellet. So the what can I describe it? The death element in it kills the snail, but it won't kill anything else that should eat it. So if a bird should eat that dead snail, the bird isn't going to be negatively affected by the toxin that killed the snail. So if you're going to use snail and slug pellets, I try and find one that is not damaging to other birds and animals. Easy to find. There are lots and lots of brands of those things, and wherever you are in the world, I'm sure you'll be able to find it. But obviously, I didn't kill enough slugs and snails. So that's the only sort of problem I've had. The only other problem I have had with hybrid Cymbidiums out there is a bit of scale, which I didn't notice. And that I only noticed it because I could start to see the yellow dots on the top of the leaf with the scale underneath as they were sucking the life juice out of each leaf. And that's very easy to get rid of. I actually just brush them off and just keep your eye on it. But I've had this about 6 months and I've just not noticed anything. Tough as nuts, happy as Larry outside, deals with winter minimums, gonna deal with summer maximums, just kind of hose it down and keep it moist and humid in summer, you're good to go. Quite sad that botanists weren't able to find it in the wild, although I am an optimist, plant lovers, and I always think it's gonna be lurking somewhere. Anyway, plenty of seed has been distributed around the world, I think. So the plant is certainly going to be grown, and then hopefully, if it has become extinct in its native habitat, perhaps one day it can be reintroduced. Anyway, this is a wonderful plant. I feel very, very lucky to have it. Keep your eye out for species Cymbidiums. If you grow hybrid Cymbidiums, you'll be able to grow species Cymbidiums. Asterisk though, some species Cymbidiums do come from the tropics, like there's a native Australian one which comes from the north. I couldn't grow that in Melbourne, I don't think, because it's just going to need more heat and humidity than I've got, and it probably won't take winter minimums. But anyway, if you can grow your average Cymbidium hybrid, you'll probably be able to grow a lot of particularly the Himalayan and the southern Chinese Cymbidium species. So keep your eye out, and the best way to find them is by joining your local orchid growing group, society, organization, whatever it might be, or keeping your eyes peeled for orchid sales, which happen, I have discovered, more frequently than I imagined. You just got to kind of keep your eye open. Anyway, go out and join a club. That is your homework. So plant lovers, thank you very much for joining me. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you for sharing the delight and the joy of this orchid, and I look forward to seeing you next week with whatever my continuing adventure might be. I do post every Friday, so hit subscribe and the notification bell if you want to know my adventure exactly as it pings into your inbox. Until then, look forward to seeing you. Take care until next week.